June 6, 1816. A farmer in Vermont walks out to his field at dawn. There is snow on the ground. Not frost, snow. In June. He had planted weeks earlier. The seeds are already in the soil. He stands there and looks at his field and understands, without anyone telling him, that this year there will be no harvest. Across New England that summer, temperatures dropped below freezing in July. Ice formed on ponds in August. Crops failed across the entire northern hemisphere. In Europe, grain prices tripled. Food riots broke out in France, in Switzerland, in England. In China, summer snows killed the rice harvest across 3 provinces. In India, the monsoon failed. The official explanation is clean. Mount Tambora, Indonesia, April 1815. The largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. Ash ejected into the stratosphere. Global cooling for 18 months. I accepted that explanation for a long time. Then I started asking a question that wouldn't leave me alone. Not what caused the cold, but what came after it. Because what came after 1816 was not recovery. What came after 1816 was reorganization. Global, coordinated, institutional reorganization on a scale that a volcanic winter has never, before or since, required. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I want to be precise about what the climate data actually shows, because the volcanic explanation is not wrong. Tambora erupted. The eruption was massive. Volcanic ash does produce atmospheric cooling. All of that is true. What the volcanic model cannot explain is the pattern of the cooling. Volcanic ash distributes through the atmosphere along predictable circulation patterns. The cooling it produces should be gradual, building over months. It should be roughly uniform across latitudes. Recovery should be slow and symmetrical. The 1816 data shows none of that. The cooling was not uniform. New England was devastated. Parts of Europe were hit catastrophically, but other regions at the same latitude showed minimal impact. The temperature drops do not follow atmospheric circulation patterns. They show localized severity. Specific regions hit far harder than the volcanic model predicts. Others left nearly untouched. The onset was too abrupt. Volcanic winter builds. It does not appear. The worst effects of 1816 came on too quickly, and in some regional records, climate disruptions appear before Tambora's eruption date. That is not how volcanic ash works. Ash doesn't travel backwards in time. What the pattern actually resembles, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, is blast distribution. Not ash dispersed gradually through wind patterns. Something more immediate, more localized, something that hit specific regions with catastrophic intensity while leaving others relatively untouched. The atmospheric scientists who study this period still publish papers trying to reconcile the 1816 data with the volcanic model. They continue to struggle. Not because they're wrong about Tambora, because Tambora may not be the complete explanation. And the deeper I went into what followed, the more I understood that the climate anomaly might have been the smallest part of what happened in 1816. Between 1845 and 1880, something extraordinary happened to the built landscape of the Western world. Across the United States, across Britain, across continental Europe, massive stone institutional buildings appeared. Not gradually, not regionally, simultaneously. Hundreds of them, built to the same specifications, following the same architectural logic. They were called asylums. The standard history describes them as a humanitarian reform. the replacement of brutal poorhouses and prisons with purpose-built facilities for the mentally ill. I don't doubt that humanitarian language was used. What I question is whether humanitarian purpose explains the buildings that were actually constructed. In 1848, a Philadelphia architect named Thomas Kirkbride published a document called On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane. The Kirkbride Plan. It specified construction requirements with unusual precision. Massive stone foundations, reinforced load-bearing walls, sophisticated ventilation systems running through the entire structure, heating infrastructure that could maintain internal temperatures independent of external conditions, capacity for hundreds of residents, self-sufficient food production on the grounds, high perimeter walls, controlled access points.
Kirkbride framed all of this as therapeutic. Fresh air, natural light, productive labor, calm surroundings. But here is what I couldn't reconcile. The ventilation systems in Kirkbride buildings are not designed for fresh air. They are designed for filtration, multiple-stage air handling through chambers that serve no therapeutic purpose and add enormous construction cost. The heating infrastructure is not sized for patient comfort. It is sized for sustained operation under external atmospheric crisis. The reinforced construction exceeds any structural requirement for housing civilian patients. These buildings were not designed for healing. They were designed for containment of people and of something the people might say. By 1880, over 70 Kirkbride institutions had been built across North America alone, each one a stone fortress, each one built to survive conditions that had nothing to do with mental illness. Ask yourself who was being housed in them, and then ask what those people might have remembered. Here is what keeps me awake at night. The diagnosis records from the Asylum Boom period contain a category of commitment that appears nowhere in modern psychiatry. The diagnosis was nostalgia. Not depression, not psychosis, not any condition we would recognize today as mental illness. Nostalgia. Defined in the admissions records as persistent dwelling on a past that no longer exists. Inability to accept present conditions. Confusion of thought regarding the nature of the current world. I sat with that definition for a long time, because there is a population for whom that diagnosis would be accurate, not as mental illness, but as a precise description of their actual condition. People who remembered a world before 1816, people who described buildings, technologies, systems, structures that no longer existed, or that the new authorities insisted had never existed. People whose memories did not match the official story of what the world had always been. Confusion of thought regarding the nature of the current world. What do you call it when a person accurately remembers a reality that the institutions around them are actively denying? In the 1850s, you called it nostalgia. You built a Kirkbride fortress to house them in. You surrounded them with high walls and filtered air, and the institutional silence of a place designed specifically so that what was said inside would never reach the outside. The silence was deafening, and it was engineered. Between 1853 and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were loaded onto trains in the cities of the American East Coast and redistributed across the rural interior. The official history calls this the Orphan Train movement, a humanitarian response to urban overcrowding.
charitable organizations rescuing street children from poverty. I want to look at the actual numbers. 250,000 children, over 76 years. That is roughly 3,300 children per year, every year, systematically removed from their places of origin and relocated to new families in new regions. The documentation is sparse. Records of origin are frequently missing. Family histories terminate abruptly, not at the point of the child's birth, but at a specific earlier point, as if the records before a certain date simply don't exist or were removed. The official explanation is urban poverty following industrialization, but the timeline breaks the official explanation. The Orphan Train movement began in 1853, 37 years after 1816. If this was a response to famine and displacement, why the 37-year gap? And why did it continue for 76 years? Tambora's effects lasted 18 months. The institutional response lasted nearly 8 decades. Here is what the demographic reset actually required. The generation that survived 1816 as adults carried memories, specific memories, of infrastructure, of technologies, of a world that the new authorities were actively overwriting. Those adults could not be fully silenced. Some were committed, some died, some talked to their children, to their grandchildren. The children were the vulnerability. A child raised by parents who remembered the old world would inherit fragments of that memory, would ask questions, would notice discrepancies, would look at certain buildings and ask why they were built the way they were built. Remove the child. Place the child with a new family in a new region. No parents, no grandparents, no community memory. No one to answer the questions, because no one around them knew to ask them. The orphan trains were not charity. They were a demographic reset, the systematic removal of children from the tainted memory of their parents to raise them as compliant citizens of the new order, as technological orphans who would inherit the infrastructure without inheriting the knowledge of what it was.
Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And here is the coordination problem that the official narrative cannot solve. The orphan trains required institutional infrastructure, reception committees in destination cities, placement networks across rural regions, standardized documentation systems, national-scale coordination. The telegraph wasn't widely deployed until the 1850s. International communication was limited. Yet the response to 1816, the asylum construction, the population redistribution, the orphan movement, shows a level of coordination that officially should not have been possible. Isolated regions developing identical responses to a global disaster without the infrastructure to coordinate those responses. That is not crisis management. That is a plan being executed. By the 1850s, when industrial development supposedly hit its stride, when the textbooks describe humanity inventing new technologies, building new systems, achieving new capabilities, we weren't inventing. We were recovering. The precision manufacturing, the advanced metallurgy, the sophisticated construction techniques, the acoustic engineering in buildings supposedly built by people who had no acoustic science, the astronomical alignments in structures attributed to scientifically illiterate laborers. All of it appears in fragments before 1816. After 1816, it slowly reemerges, as if being pieced back together by people who could see the physical evidence of what had existed, but no longer had the knowledge to fully understand it. That is not progress. That is recovery. And if it was recovery, what was lost? What knowledge existed before the break that took generations to reconstruct? What capabilities did the pre-1816 world possess that we only regained through decades of incomplete effort? They didn't just change history, they re-inherited a masterpiece and handed the inheritors a story about how they'd built it themselves. We are living in those ruins. The Kirkbride asylums are still standing. Many are abandoned now, their populations gone, their purpose officially achieved, their records incomplete. Walk through one and look at the ventilation systems. Look at the reinforced walls. Ask yourself what those walls were designed to keep in. The Orphan Train generation became the grandparents of the generation alive today. Their family records terminate at a specific point. Their origin is officially unknown. They were the first citizens of the New World, raised without memory, without inheritance, without the questions that memory would have required them to ask. The adults who remembered were committed. The children who might have remembered were relocated. The buildings that encoded the old knowledge were either demolished or repurposed or left to decay quietly in places where no one thought to look. And the volcano was given the credit. A natural disaster, comprehensible, terrible, over. Something that required no further questions because nature doesn't have intentions. The question isn't whether something happened beyond the official narrative. The evidence makes that almost certain. The question is what we're still not being told about the world before 1816, and what was lost or hidden when that world ended. Truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just waits for the right questions. And here is the question I keep returning to. How does a volcanic winter, 18 months of climate disruption, produce an institutional response that runs for 8 decades? How does a natural disaster require the construction of hundreds of fortified stone buildings across multiple continents, all following the same architectural specifications, all appearing within the same compressed time frame? How does crop failure produce a psychiatric diagnosis specifically targeting people who remember a different world? How does famine create 250,000 children with no documented family history? These aren't radical questions. They are basic observations about documented evidence that the official narrative cannot accommodate. The volcanic explanation accounts for the cold. It does not account for what the cold was used to cover, because that is what 1816 was. Not just a disaster, a window, a moment of sufficient chaos that the reorganization could be completed before anyone had the stability to ask what was being reorganized and why. The Tartarian infrastructure, the buildings, the systems, the acoustic networks, the technologies that ran through the stone of every major city on Earth was already damaged, already compromised, already in the process of being dismantled and overwritten. 1816 finished the job. The year without a summer was the cover story for the year without a memory.
The Kirkbride plan is documented. The Asylum Boom is documented. The diagnosis of nostalgia is in the admissions records. The Orphan Train numbers are not disputed. 250,000 children, 76 years. The coordination problem has no official answer. Next time you see a massive stone institutional building from the mid-19th century, look at the ventilation. Look at the walls. Ask what it was really built for. Ask who was inside. Ask what they remembered. The next video goes deeper into the specific regions hit hardest in 1816 and what the pre-existing infrastructure there looked like before the official record begins. If this opened something you can't close, you know what to do.